2 papers take us to Poland, and then Poland and Paris. This is clearly why I'm the chair. I'm currently a student in advanced Polish. I should be home studying for my exam. Our first speaker is our next speaker is Siobhan Doucette from Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, who will speak on Poland as a location for Tamizdat. Thank you.
I wanted to say thank you for organizing this conference and for giving me the opportunity to meet a number of scholars who I read and admire. So thank you very much. Again, I'm going to be talking today about Poland as a location for Tamizdat. In 1976, activists in the Polish Democratic Opposition first smuggled printing machines into Poland with the intention of publishing materials independent of state censorship. In 1977, the first independent publishing houses were created in Poland. The most important independent publishing house was Nova. By 1989, it had produced 315 books and numerous journals and newspapers. In 1989, Nova was one of over a dozen well-developed publishing houses in Poland within the second circulation. And this is in part why in Poland the term Samizdat was not used, in part, and rather second circulation. Samizdat suggests a form of production, as we've talked about already today. And in Poland, much of the independent press came through publishing houses. The term drugi obieg, or second circulation, is the Polish term for this massive independent press, which existed alongside state publishing. To give you a sense of the numbers, from 1976 to 1989, the Polish second circulation produced an estimated 6,500 monograph printings and 5,500 serial titles. The vast majority of these were brief and ephemeral, obviously. However, the most important second circulation publishing houses produced print runs for books in the thousands and print runs for newspapers in tens of thousands. And the newspapers by the late 80s were appearing weekly. The regular readership for the independent press has been estimated at between 2 and 3 million for most of the 1980s. 1981, of course, it was much larger, and again in 1989 it was much larger, but 2 to 3 million people is for the regular readership. I mean, those who read it sporadically would have been much higher. Such extensive print runs and that large readership, again, came in the 1980s. In the early 1970s, activists in the Polish Democratic Opposition often commented on how envious they were of Soviet Samizdat publishing networks, which were then more extensive than anything that could have been dreamed of in Poland, again in the early 70s. The change in Poland came in 1976. In that year, as we probably all know, there was a wave of workers' protests which stimulated the founding of the Committee for the Defense of Workers, which began publishing reports on state repression, and these were consciously in some ways modeled on the reports of the Moscow-Helsinki group. Also in 1976, a group of Polish students, actually completely independent of CORE, smuggled a printing machine into Poland. And there were debates within the Democratic opposition over the desirability of using printing machines. I think, strikingly, for instance, Jacek Koran had thought that it was a bad idea, and I think it was more radical. And yet the decision was made ultimately to use printing machines. And so from 1977 you see a progressive use in Poland of printing machines. Konrad Bocheński, one of the founders of the Polish second circulation, stated, quote, "The idea of using duplicating machines was a revolution in scale within the entire bloc," end quote. And it's this revolution which eventually allowed Poland to become a location for Tamizdat production, or at least that's what I'm arguing. When discussing Tamizdat, the there we usually think of is the West. The standard narrative is that these are publications coming from Eastern Europe being published in Western Europe, in North America. However, the breadth of the Polish second circulation in the 1980s meant that such works could also be produced in publishing houses behind the Iron Curtain, thanks to second circulation publishers in Poland. When in 1977 the first second circulation publishing houses were created in Poland, those at the forefront of the publishing houses were committed to respecting copyright and to reimbursing authors for their works. And again, just as there had been debates over the desirability of using duplicating machines, there were quite heated debates, according to the interviews I've done, over whether to charge for publications or not. But the decision in Poland was to charge for the wares, the second circulation. And this meant that by 1978, Polish second circulation publishers routinely were able to pay printers. By 1978, there was a small group of printers who were working exclusively as second circulation printers, editors and authors for their work. Decisively, this became a norm moving forward within the Polish second circulation. And although there were monographs published in the Polish independent press in the 1970s, the most important publications in that period were largely journals. And the first literary journal produced in the Polish second circulation was a journal called Zapis. And it remained the premier literary journal in the Polish second circulation throughout the 1970s. It was also reproduced abroad by the Index of Censorship. The second issue of Zapis in 1977 reproduced letters by Jan Patočka in Polish translation. In 1978, Zapis published Polish translations of poetry by Natalia Gorbanowskaja. Also in 1978, after the legendary meeting between Polish activists from KOR and Czech dissidents from Charter 77 on Mount Śnieżka, Zapis published articles by Jan Waculik, Zdeněk Mlynarz, Jerzy Borasz, and Václav Havel. Cooperation with Czech authors was particularly notable in the 1970s in the Polish second circulation. We see it again in the journal Krytyka, which began publication in 1978. On the editorial board were not only well-known democratic opposition activists like Adam Michnik and Jacek Kurum, but also Václav Havel. The first issue of Krytyka included essays by Alexander Solzhenitsyn as well as Havel. In the second issue, over half of the content was from Czech authors. Again, this issue came right after that meeting on Mount Śnieżka, and it also included a number of documents from Charter 77. The third issue of Krytyka included an essay by Zinoviev. In Lublin, the premier second circulation publishing venture in the 1970s was Spotkania. Activists connected to Spotkania produced the journal Spotkania, which published Czech dissidents frequently. The Spotkania publishing group also did something I thought was quite interesting, and that is in 1979 they translated Pope John Paul II's Redemptor Hominis into Czech, published it, and then smuggled it into Czechoslovakia. Among the estimated 160 monograph printings produced in the second circulation prior to the birth of Solidarity in 1980 was Alexander Solzhenitsyn's 1978 Harvard commencement address, and also Bohumil Hrabal's Too Loud a Solitude. As this brief overview, I know it's brief, should give you a sense that while the independent press grew dramatically in the 1970s in Poland, it was not yet a viable location for Tamizdat production. Although a number of works by neighboring authors were published, the focus to a significant degree was publishing Polish authors, particularly authors who had been published previously from the Institut Literacki in Paris, which Professor Grudzinska will talk about more in a few minutes. It was in the wake of the strike wave, which consumed Poland in the summer of 1980, that things really changed. The government and the August Social Accords not only allowed for the independent trade unions, which gives us solidarity in September 1980, they also agreed to the publication of trade union bulletins without preventative state censorship. And with the birth of Solidarity, again to give you some numbers, the second circulation expanded exponentially. In 1981, an estimated 1,896 serial titles and 2,500 monograph printings were produced. Again, most of these were ephemeral, most were brief, but not all. But one thing that's very important, I think, for this period is that just as those who participated in the Solidarity trade union embraced the idea of a self-limiting revolution, Solidarity's publishers self-censored. They understood that they were supposed to publish works dealing with the trade union, and that's mostly what was published in the 1980s. Even those who weren't directly connected to the Solidarity trade union had a feeling that publishing anything else could be perceived as a provocation and thus put the entire movement at risk. However, by late 1981, as government intransigence kind of encouraged a degree of lessening self-limitations within the Solidarity trade union, we also see in 1981 the independent press becoming less self-censored. Polish independent publishers in 1980, and one of the things that there was a strong understanding was publishing authors who were banned abroad just was not something to be done in 1980 and certainly into early 1981. However, by late 1981, Polish independent publishers produced Yefrayev, Daniel, Akhmatova, Bulgakov, among other Russian authors. Nadzieja Mandelstam was extremely popular. Hope Abandoned and Hope Against Hope were both published by more than one publisher. The Polish translation of Sandra Kopacki's Hungry 56 was published 8 times in 1981, suggesting that it was in high demand. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was quite popular with the Polish second circulation in late 1981. Matryona's Place and The Love Girl and the Innocent were both published by 2 publishing houses, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Warning to the West, and Solzhenitsyn's Harvard Commencement were also published. Most important and popular was Gulag Archipelago. It was published for the first time in full in the Eastern Bloc by the Torunska Oficina Niezależna in 1981. In addition, it was excerpted in a number of publications. Notably, it was excerpted in the Trade Union Bulletin at the Katowice Steelworks, which is notable because for a Solidarity publication to choose to publish it was quite something, even in late 1981. In fact, it went over so well with readers that the publishers at the Katowice Steelworks went to Nova, which was this main publishing house, and which held the copyright for Gulag Archipelago in Poland, and gained permission to reprint the entire book on Solidarity printers in the steelworks. Martial law was declared before the book was released. At the same time, it certainly suggests the trajectory that was developing within the Polish second circulation, which I'm arguing was making it a more viable place for Tamizdat. The declaration of martial law on December 13th, 1981 really kind of put a halt to a lot of these trajectories. Certainly martial law meant that the idea of self-censorship was no longer important. However, the focus in much of the second circulation in 1982 was on simply proving that solidarity still existed and what was happening in the country. So in 1982, the second circulation, we see much fewer literature, both Polish and international, and the focus really tended to be on short news information that was letting the community know that there were still people out there, really, in many ways. That's not to say there was no exceptions. Bohumil Hrabal's Too Loud a Solitude was republished in Polish translation in 1982. However, the overwhelming focus in 82 was not on literature. By 1983, with the second circulation firmly established underground, Polish independent publishers began to again publish works from neighboring countries who could not be published in their home countries. In 1983, Polish second circulation publishers produced books by Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak, Zinoviev, Bukowski, and Mandelstam. The Polish translation of Faithful Ruslan was the hit in the underground in 1983 for Nova. Also in 1983, Milan Kundera was first published in the Polish second circulation. Farewell Waltz was published by 2 publishing houses that year. It was so popular, the first edition, that it was immediately republished. And these publications reflected broader changes occurring within the Polish second circulation in terms of printing capabilities and content. And this is why I'm arguing that Poland became a location for Tamizdat, because one, during the 1980s, the Polish second circulation developed into an industry with the expertise necessary to produce books on a mass scale. And 2, by the 1980s, it had been around long enough that there was interest in publishing not just books about Poland that had been missing on the market for so long. And so discussing improved production and distribution capabilities. By the 1980s, there were well-developed smuggling routes, regularly bringing printing machines into Poland. Lessons in screen printing were a norm within the Polish underground. And shops had actually been created for the manufacture of printing machines, which is a really interesting topic, I think. With more printing machines in the underground, often publishers didn't even produce all the works on their own. Print shops were created where people had their own printing machine, and the publishing house would give them printing matrices, which they printed books from. And this was also considered a good way to deal with the potential for seizures by the police. If it was being printed at more than one location, a seizure couldn't destroy the entire print run. Authors were progressively paid more. While in the 1970s, authors' honorariums were often nominal, by the mid-1980s, about 20% to 30% of sales for the Nova Publishing House, for instance, went to authors. And speaking to the point that Professor Nathan mentioned, that at the Xavier Publishing House, writers were paid 20% of sales, and they said specifically this was because they were trying to create a capitalist Poland, and so they had to have a publishing house that reflected that change. Thanks to improved production mechanisms, about several hundred serial titles and several hundred monograph printings were produced annually through the 1980s. And many of the monographs were brochures, but on average between 200 and 300 books were produced each year in the independent press up until 1989, and there's significantly more. In 1985, a consortium of the leading publishing houses was created to help with the acquiring of supplies, distribution, and in ensuring that copyright was respected. If you did not respect copyright, you couldn't get any of the funds from the consortium. And the second circulation is in this period from about 1985, the number of members in the independent press, particularly printers, started calling it the industrial phase, and they look at it nostalgically at the time period before that. In 1986, an independent publishing house fund was created, which insured equipment, cars, and even people, meaning if you were arrested and had fines to pay, the publishing house insurance fund paid them for you. Dozens of publishing houses paid into this fund, which had an annual budget of millions of zloty, and I think really reflects the degree to which you have an industry being created in a very strange kind of way. The publication of titles by authors from neighboring countries became desirable, in part in this period from the 1980s, because the editors of Polish independent publishing ventures, in the midst of relentless state repression and rising costs, were vying for readers, and they found that readers liked those books. That's why they started printing them in higher numbers. In 1984, one of the best sellers of the underground was Milan Kundera's The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, which was published by Przedświat, one of the major publishing houses. Also in 1984, Vasily Grossman's Forever Flowing was published by Krong, which noted that it was requested every year after. In 1984, an editor at Nova, which was this premier publishing house, explained in an interview in the independent press that Nova would in the next year be focusing on the publication of works by Russian authors, and that they would therefore be investing in translators. That year, Nova published works by Bazanov, Suvorov, and Zinoviev. Unfortunately, that was also the year that Nova had its worst raids in the entire time of its existence in terms of police raids, which might explain why there weren't more. As the 1980s progressed and competition in the second circulation increased with a proto-market developing, publishers administered polls of readers to find out what they liked best to make sure that they were responsive to those demands. In June 1986, the Kraków student paper, Promieniści, published a poll of its readers and found that Gulag Archipelago was the most sought book in the underground. Joanna Szczęsna, a leading activist in Solidarity Publishing, in the summer of 1987, met with a number of distributors and found that highest interest was in works by Russian, Czech, and Hungarian dissidents. And publishers responded to this popular demand. Every year unfortunately, I was hoping to have more time to work on this, but I tallied all of the books by Russian, Czech, and to a last degree Hungarian authors in the second circulation held by the Archiwum KARTA, which is the biggest holder of second circulation publications in Poland. And every year there were at least 20 books to sometimes 30 books published by such authors. And of course there would have been more if I'd had time to look at more authors, but the low figure is 28 to 30 books a year. And publishers produced works by Brodsky, Bukovsky, Bulgakov, Maximov, Amalrik, Ratushinskaya, Shalamov, Solzhenitsyn, Vladimov, Yakunin, Zinoviev, and all of those authors were published more than once. I just decided to mention those who had at least 2 publications. Czechs were published: Jerzy Grusha, Bohumil Hraba, Václav Havel, Kohut, Kryl, Kundera, I mentioned, Patočka, my favorite, Josef Škvoretzky, and then others from the bloc, Danilo Kis, Janos Kis, Tomas Venslova, and so the bestseller in 1988 was the hardcover edition of Gulag Archipelago by Pomo's publishing house. And the fact that it was a hardcover edition, 3 volumes, is in some ways a testament to how this publishing movement developed. And publications by neighboring dissidents not only found place in monographs, but also in journals. The most important independent journal in Krakow was the journal Arka, which in 1985-1986 published an issue in cooperation with the Russian emigrant paper, Russkaya Mysl. The issue was published in the Russian language and was entirely composed of text by Russian authors. It had a print run of 2,000. Every issue of the journal Brulion, which was also published in Krakow, this was published quarterly for 1987, included original literature, both poetry and prose, from dissidents from the bloc. It published works by Ivan Klima, Josef Shkvoretsky, Solzhenitsyn. A special issue dedicated to Brodsky was published in 1988 when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was another figure who was frequently published in the Polish second circulation. A number of journals in the second circulation in the mid and late 1980s focused entirely on Poland's neighbors. Such journals included Oboz, Międzymorzia, ABC, Nova Koalicja, and these therefore in every issue included mostly journals and short literary pieces by people from the rest of the bloc. Journals were made in relation to specific countries, notably Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and Hungary. In 1987, Polish-Czechoslovak Solidarity began publishing a bulletin. Every issue, at least half, was by Czech authors. From 1987, Dialogi was published, which was focused on improving Poland's relationship with Ukraine. And